Have you ever noticed how most people do everything they can to avoid being alone? They fill up their schedules, check their phones every minute, turn on the TV just to have background noise. But why are so many people afraid of silence? What happens when all the voices go quiet and you're face to face with yourself? Could there be something inside you that you'd rather not confront? The truth is that solitude works like a test. It doesn't ask what you do, how much you make, or how many friends you have. It simply puts you in front of a mirror and asks, "Who are you when nobody's watching?" And that question is scary because the answer might not be what we expect. Two philosophers understood this better than anyone. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard saw in solitude something far beyond the simple lack of company. For them, being alone is the moment when everything you've built about yourself can crumble. And that's exactly why so many people run from this experience like they're running from mortal danger. Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher who lived in the 19th century. He became famous for having a pretty pessimistic view of life. While other thinkers of his time talked about progress and optimism, he went against the grain. For Schopenhauer, suffering wasn't an accident in human existence, it was its essence. And he looked at society with very critical eyes. When he observed the people around him, Schopenhauer saw a grand theater. Everyone wore masks, played roles, pretended to be what they weren't. People worried about appearances, status, other people's opinions. All of this served one purpose: to avoid the encounter with their own essence. Because when you strip away all those layers, what's left can be too uncomfortable to face. In his view, we spend our entire lives distracting ourselves. We chase after achievements, recognition, pleasures that pass quickly. We do this because, deep down, we know there's a void. And that void only appears clearly when we're alone, with nothing to occupy us, no one to validate us. It's in that silence that the masks start to fall. You don't have to smile anymore if you don't want to. You don't have to agree with anyone. You don't have to maintain an image. And when these defenses fall, something that normally stays hidden emerges. Your raw truth. Not the edited version you show the world, but what actually exists inside you. Schopenhauer believed that few people had the courage to look at this truth head-on. On the other side of Europe, another thinker was observing the same human problem from a different angle. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher, also from the 19th century, who's now considered the father of existentialism. Unlike Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard was deeply religious, but his religiosity had nothing to do with mindlessly following traditions. He looked at the crowds of people living on autopilot, following what everyone else did, thinking what everyone else thought. These people never stopped to question anything. They simply went with the flow, did what was expected, believed what they were told to believe. For Kierkegaard, this wasn't really living. It was just existing as part of a herd, without their own identity, without genuine choices. And solitude was the moment when someone finally separated themselves from that mass. It was when the individual emerged from the collective and assumed their singularity, with everything that meant. He had a powerful phrase that summarized this thought: "The crowd is untruth." What does that mean? That when you always live surrounded by other people, always doing what everyone does, you lose touch with your own truth. You become a copy, an echo. Only in solitude is it possible to discover who you really are, because only there you don't have the pressure of the group pushing you in one direction. There are no external voices telling you what to think, what to feel, what to choose. It's you with yourself, and that can be liberating or terrifying, depending on what you find in there. But there's a problem with this discovery. When you finally get to be alone, a lot starts to crumble. All those certainties you carried, all those beliefs you inherited from family, school, religion, culture, start to be questioned. Because now, there's nobody reinforcing these ideas, no group reminding you what you should think. It's like you've lived your whole life wearing borrowed clothes. And suddenly, in solitude, you realize these clothes aren't yours. They were chosen by other people, at another time, for other purposes. And that uncomfortable question arises: what's actually mine? What did I truly choose? What do I believe when there's nobody telling me what to believe? Both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard understood that this process was painful. Inherited beliefs work like armor. They protect you from having to think for yourself, from having to make difficult choices, from having to take total responsibility for your life. But when solitude arrives, that armor starts to crack. And you realize you were protected, but also trapped. Schopenhauer understood that boredom worked as a powerful revealer. When you remove all the stimuli, all the distractions, what happens? For a lot of people, a huge void emerges. This void shows that life was being filled with things that had no real importance. They were just ways to kill time, to avoid thinking, to run from yourself. And Kierkegaard saw these distractions even more critically. For him, people constantly entertained themselves because they feared existential anguish. They were afraid to come face to face with questions without easy answers, so they filled their lives with noise, with movement, with anything that prevented silence from settling in. It was a desperate flight from themselves. But when everything finally goes silent, the truth appears. And this truth is almost never comfortable. It can show that you spent years following a path that wasn't yours. It can reveal that your relationships are superficial. It can expose fears you didn't even know you had. It can make it clear that you wasted precious time on things that didn't matter. That's why so many people avoid this moment with all their strength. Modern entertainment makes this escape really easy. In the old days, if you wanted to distract yourself, you had to make an effort. Today, distraction is always just a click away. Social media, series, games, endless news. You never have to be alone with your thoughts if you don't want to. And most people choose exactly that, never to truly be alone. Schopenhauer had a cruel but honest observation. An empty mind suffers intensely when it's alone. If you haven't cultivated anything within yourself, if you haven't developed your own thoughts, genuine interests, a rich inner life, then solitude is going to be torture. Because you're going to be stuck with someone you can't stand, yourself. It's like being locked in a room with a boring person, except that person is you. Kierkegaard saw solitude as the moment of anguish. And anguish, for him, wasn't just a passing discomfort. It was the confrontation with your own freedom and responsibility. When you're alone, you can't blame others anymore. You can't hide behind the group anymore. You can't pretend the choices aren't yours. You are free, completely free. And that's terrifying. Because freedom isn't just being able to choose. It's having to choose. It's not being able to escape responsibility. It's knowing that your life is the result of your decisions, and not of external forces, not of fate, not of luck. A lot of people would prefer not to have this freedom, would prefer to be able to blame something or someone. But in solitude, that illusion doesn't hold up. The quality of your experience of solitude depends directly on the quality of your mind. If you have inner content, if you've cultivated something valuable within yourself, solitude can even be pleasant. It can be a moment of peace, reflection, creativity. But if your mind is just an echo of outside voices, if you've never developed anything of your own, then being alone is like being trapped in an empty room. Silence has a strange power to reveal our real condition. There's a French thinker named Pascal who said something interesting. The eternal silence of infinite spaces terrifies. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard also recognize this abyss that opens when everything goes quiet. It's not just silence of sound, but silence of meaning, of purpose, of certainties that once seemed solid. For Schopenhauer, this silence revealed something fundamental about the nature of existence. He spoke of a blind force that moves everything, a will without direction, without final purpose. It's as if life were just desire leading to more desire, suffering generating more suffering. And when you're alone, without distractions, this truth imposes itself brutally. You realize you're trapped in a wheel that spins endlessly, without getting anywhere. Each satisfied desire brings only temporary relief, soon replaced by a new desire, or by boredom. Each achieved goal loses its shine as soon as it's conquered, and suffering, whether through pursuit, frustration, or boredom, always comes back. This was Schopenhauer's pessimistic view, but he didn't see it as reason for despair. He saw it as lucidity. For Kierkegaard, silence was the space where the leap of faith became possible, but also where anguish could consume. It was a void that needed to be filled with an inner decision, with a radical choice. Either you embraced this condition and did something with it, transforming anguish into authentic faith, or you sank into despair. There was no comfortable middle ground, and it's exactly at this point that the strongest temptation to flee arises. When solitude starts to reveal uncomfortable truths, when you realize you're not who you thought you were, when certainties start to crack, the most common reaction is to run away. Grab your phone, open social media, call someone, do anything that brings noise back into your life. Schopenhauer called this evasion of suffering. People can't bear the pain of seeing reality as it is, so they invent 1,000 ways to escape. Empty relationships that only serve to not be alone. Constant entertainment that prevents any moment of reflection. Excessive work that fills every minute of the day. Drinking, drugs, compulsive shopping, all to avoid having to stop and look inward. Kierkegaard had a specific name for this: aesthetic despair. It's when you live only on the surface, jumping from one distraction to another, always in search of the next pleasure, the next novelty, but never stopping to build something deep. It's a life of permanent flight, and the problem is you can never really run from yourself. You can postpone the confrontation, but you can't avoid it forever. This constant flight reveals something important about identity. Schopenhauer valued what he called self-sufficient spirits. They were people who were enough for themselves, who didn't need constant approval from others, who had sufficient inner content to live well even alone. He saw these individuals as rare, true solitary geniuses who could bear their own company. Most people, in his view, depended completely on others. They couldn't spend a day alone without suffering. They needed external validation to know if they were valuable, external entertainment to avoid falling into boredom, constant company to not face the void. This dependence showed inner poverty, the lack of cultivation of their own mind. Kierkegaard also spoke of a solid inner foundation, but in a different way. For him, authentic faith and inner life were what sustained a person when everything else disappeared. It wasn't inherited faith, the kind you receive ready-made and never question. It was chosen faith, conquered through anguish and doubt, born from the personal decision to believe even without proof, even without guarantees. Solitude works as a test for this self-sufficiency. It asks, does your identity have its own roots, or does it depend completely on others? Do you know who you are when you have no audience? Do your convictions hold up when nobody's there to reinforce them? For a lot of people, the answer is painful. They discover they were just reflections of others' expectations, like mirrors that only exist when someone looks. And this can turn into a true spiritual crisis. For Kierkegaard, solitude could lead to deep and unbearable anguish. It was the moment when you saw yourself before your own freedom, before God, before infinity, with nothing to hold on to. All the easy certainties disappeared, and you had to make real choices, assume real responsibilities, without being able to delegate that to anyone. For Schopenhauer, it was the confrontation with the tragic nature of existence. It was realizing that life doesn't have a ready-made meaning waiting to be discovered, that suffering is inevitable, that all desires lead only to new desires or to frustration. This lucidity wasn't comfortable, but he believed it was necessary for those who wanted to live with honesty, without comforting but false illusions. In both cases, solitude isn't neutral. It's not just a moment of rest or peace. It shakes the soul forcefully. It forces you to face questions you'd rather avoid. It breaks illusions you spent years carefully building. And for that very reason, it demands courage. A courage that most people don't have or don't want to have. Schopenhauer said something harsh but true. Few can bear being alone with themselves because they can't bear their own minds. If your mind is full of regrets, resentments, negative thoughts, constant self-criticism, of emptiness, then being alone with it is true torture. It's like being trapped in a dark room with someone you detest, except that someone is you. That's why so many people do everything to fill their minds with external noise. Because the internal noise is unbearable. They prefer 1,000 voices from outside to having to hear their own voice. They prefer others' opinions to having to form their own. They prefer to follow the herd to having to find their own path. Because your own path requires crossing through solitude, and solitude requires facing yourself. Kierkegaard saw courage as absolutely essential in this process. Facing anguish, looking the abyss in the eyes and still making an inner leap, this required courage. It wasn't physical courage of facing external dangers or visible enemies. It was existential courage of accepting your condition, of assuming your freedom, of making choices without guarantees it would work out. Enduring the void is crossing a kind of spiritual desert. It's a period when nothing makes sense, when old truths have died, but new ones haven't been born yet. It's an uncomfortable place, arid, difficult to bear. There's no oasis, no shade, no quick relief. But it's also the place where real transformations happen. Because only when you lose everything can you rebuild something true. A lot of people start this process, but give up halfway. The pain is too great, the void is too scary, the lack of certainties is too distressing. So they run back to the old ways of living, even knowing they were false. They prefer the comfortable lie to the painful truth. And in this, they lose the chance for a real transformation, to discover who they really are beneath all the imposed layers. For Kierkegaard, something even more radical was happening in Solitude. It was the moment when the individual saw themselves alone before God. There were no intermediations, no priests or pastors saying what to do, no religious institutions with their ready-made rules, no mass to hide in. It was just you and the Absolute, face to face, with no possible escape. This experience brought radical responsibility, because there were no excuses there. You couldn't say you did something because everyone did it, or because they told you to, or because it was custom. Your choices were completely yours. And this defined whether your faith was authentic or just a social disguise. It defined whether your existence was genuine or just a performance to please others. Most people preferred institutional religion precisely because it offered ready-made answers. You didn't have to struggle with doubts. You didn't have to make anguishing choices. You didn't have to assume total responsibility. You just had to follow what tradition commanded. But for Kierkegaard, that wasn't real faith. It was just conformism disguised as religiosity. Real faith was born from anguish, from doubt, from free choice. Schopenhauer saw solitude revealing something different, but equally profound. It showed the essence of life as blind struggle, as incessant desire that never finds final satisfaction. It showed the inevitable pain of existing, the suffering that comes simply from being alive and having wants that are never fully satisfied. It was a vision without romanticism, without easy consolations. Those who had no inner content suffered intensely in this confrontation, because they had nothing to oppose against the force of this revelation. They had no thoughts cultivated over the years, no serenity built through reflection, nothing that would soften the impact of seeing life as it really was. But from this lucidity, from this brutal shock with the real, a different wisdom could be born, a wisdom without illusions. For Kierkegaard, anguish wasn't the end of the story. It was actually the beginning of something new. Anguish was the portal through which you could pass to reach a more authentic existence. It was painful. It was frightening. But it was also necessary. Without going through this desert, without facing this crisis, you remained trapped in a superficial life, a life of facade. The leap of faith he talked about wasn't an irrational leap in the dark. It was a leap that came after doubt, after anguish, after having questioned everything. It was a conscious decision to believe despite the lack of proof, to choose a path despite uncertainty. And this leap could only happen in solitude, because only there you didn't have anyone pushing you, anyone deciding for you. Both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard saw solitude as a kind of initiation. It was a test that separated the superficial from the profound, the false from the true. For Schopenhauer, few had the stomach for naked truth. Most preferred to live in comfortable illusions rather than face reality as it was. And he didn't judge this, just observed it as a fact of human nature. For Kierkegaard, few had the courage to exist as individuals before the infinite. Most preferred to dissolve into the crowd, go with the flow, never make waves. Because existing as an individual was much harder, much more lonely, much more frightening. It required making decisions without the group's approval, taking unpopular positions, living according to your own convictions, even when everyone disagreed. Solitude was this rite of passage that tested whether you had what was necessary, whether you had enough inner content to be sufficient, whether you had enough courage to face anguish, whether you had enough honesty to abandon comforting illusions, whether you had enough strength to cross the desert without giving up halfway. And that's why most people can't bear true solitude, because it dismantles the social identity that took years to build, because it questions the inherited religious consolations that were never examined. Because it ends the distractions that kept everything working. It demands lucidity when we'd prefer to continue in the comfort of ignorance. It demands inner decision when we'd prefer to go with the flow. That's why most prefer noise to silence, prefer routine to reflection, prefer blind belonging to conscious individuality. Not because they're bad or weak people, but because the path of solitude is genuinely difficult. It asks for things our social nature resists giving. It forces transformations our mind avoids. It reveals truths our ego prefers to hide. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard weren't optimistic about how many people would actually pass through this trial. They saw solitude as a natural filter. Most would stay on the outside, living collective lives, following established patterns, never really knowing themselves. And maybe it was even better that way for many, because the truth that solitude reveals can be too heavy to carry. But for those who had the courage to enter this territory, for those who were willing to pay the price, the reward was a more authentic life. Not necessarily happier in the conventional sense, not necessarily easier or more comfortable, but more real, more honest, more yours. A life lived from the inside out, not from the outside in. A life based on real choices, not on social automatisms. Schopenhauer said that the wise person seeks the absence of pain, not the presence of pleasure. And solitude, when well endured, brought this absence of pain through lucidity. You stopped seeking what you couldn't have, desiring what wouldn't bring real satisfaction, deluding yourself with empty promises. You accepted the tragic nature of life and, in this acceptance, found a kind of peace. Not a joyful peace, but a serene peace. Kierkegaard spoke of something different but complementary. He spoke of a joy that came after anguish, a faith born after doubt, an inner certainty that emerged after all external certainties had fallen. It was a deep transformation that could only happen through the suffering of solitude, through the courage to remain there when everything screamed for you to flee. In the end, both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard agreed on one essential point. Solitude reveals who you really are. It works like a photographic developer, bringing to light what was hidden in darkness. It removes all masks, all disguises, all the protections you built. And then you see. You see your truth, your essence, what remains when everything else is removed. This revelation can be painful. It can show that you lived years in a lie. It can expose vulnerabilities you didn't know you had. It can tear down idols you worshipped. But it can also be liberating. It can show strengths you didn't know you possessed. It can reveal paths you never saw. It can open possibilities that were closed while you followed the herd. Solitude puts everything you believe to the test because it removes all external supports. There's no group validating your beliefs. There's no tradition saying it's always been this way. There's no authority guaranteeing you're right. It's just you and your ideas, naked and raw. And many of them don't survive this test. They fall like houses of cards when the wind blows. But the ones that survive, the ones that remain even when everything else falls, those are truly yours. Those you truly chose, not because of social pressure, not because of custom, not because of fear, but because they made sense to you, alone, in silence, when there was nobody to impress. And these beliefs become the solid foundation of an authentic life. Schopenhauer showed the real without filter. Life as struggle, as unsatisfied desire, as inevitable suffering. Solitude revealed this truth brutally. There was no escaping it when you were alone. There weren't enough distractions, superficial relationships, temporary pleasures to hide what was fundamental. And a lot of people didn't want to see this. They preferred illusion to lucidity. Kierkegaard revealed the self before the absolute. Solitude removed all the intermediaries, all the institutions, all the traditions that stood between you and God. It was a direct encounter, without protections. And in this encounter, you had to decide. You couldn't live on autopilot anymore, following what they told you. You had to make a real choice, take a real position, live according to something you truly believed. In solitude, there's no audience to applaud. There are no judges to approve. There's no cheering section to give you support. It's just you and the truth. And that truth can be about the nature of life, about who you are, about what really matters, about what you believe when there's nobody telling you what to believe. It's a confrontation without witnesses, without protections, without escape routes. That's why it puts everything you believe to the test. Because believing is easy when everyone around you believes the same thing. It's comfortable when culture reinforces your ideas. It's simple when you never have to defend your positions alone. But in solitude, your beliefs face the hardest test. Do they hold up when there's nothing but themselves to hold them up? And that's why so few have the courage to stay there. Not because they're weak or bad, but because it's genuinely frightening to see everything you built being questioned. It's painful to discover that much of what you thought was yours was just borrowed. It's difficult to accept that maybe you don't know as much about yourself as you imagined. Solitude demands that you be honest. Brutally honest. Because there's no point lying to yourself when there's nobody to witness the lie. Either you face the truth, or you run. And running means going back to the noise, to the crowd, to the distractions. It means giving up the possibility of truly knowing yourself. It means accepting to live a second-hand life, based on others' ideas, others' values, others' dreams. Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard didn't promise it would be easy. They didn't sell illusions of guaranteed happiness or instant peace. They told the truth. Solitude is difficult. Lucidity hurts. Anguish consumes. The desert is arid and long. There's no oasis, no shade, no quick relief. But they also said it was necessary. That without going through this, you'd never know who you really are. You'd never live an authentic life. You'd never be more than an echo of the voices around you. Solitude is the mirror that doesn't lie. It's the test that can't be fooled. It's the trial that reveals whether your convictions have deep roots, or if they're just shallow plants that fall with the first strong wind. And maybe that's why it's so scary. Because deep down, a lot of people suspect their roots aren't as deep as they'd like, and they'd rather not find out for sure. So the question remains, do you have the courage to truly be alone, to turn off all the distractions, to be in silence, to encounter only yourself, to let this encounter question everything you think you know, to risk discovering that much of what you believed wasn't really yours? It's a decision nobody can make for you, and maybe it's the most important decision you'll ever make. Because in the end, Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard show us something essential. Solitude isn't the enemy. It's the teacher. It teaches through discomfort, reveals through silence, transforms through anguish. And those who have the courage to learn from it come out different. Not necessarily happier, but certainly more real. Not necessarily with all the answers, but certainly with more honest questions. Not necessarily free from suffering, but certainly free from illusions. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this topic touched you. Maybe you also feel this fear of solitude. Or maybe you're going through a moment like this right now. What's important is to understand that you're not alone in this human experience of having to confront yourself. Great thinkers dedicated their lives to trying to understand this mystery that each of us carries inside. If this video made you think, if it helped you understand something about yourself, or about this human experience of solitude, leave your like down below. And subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-knowledge with me. See you in the next video.